Good bearings can make things move really easily. This video is about my experience of using bearings. I make arcade machines and clocks and other weird contraptions. I've been in this workshop 40 years and practically everything I make has bearings of some sort or other in it. I'm not a bearing expert though, and I'm sure some bearing experts would be horrified by what I do. If you want to skip to a particular chapter, here are the contents. Well, when I was a kid and I didn't have my nice workshop or any tools, it was very hard, and I feel sorry for today's kids trying to make things out of paper cups and drinking straws and stuff like that. Because there wasn't PVA, there wasn't hot glue, there weren't even bamboo kebab sticks, which I'm quite fond of now. So you just poke it through a shoebox. I should have said I used to make everything out of shoeboxes when I was a kid, and shoeboxes and sellotape. And then I haven't even done this very straight, but you'll get the idea. Oops. It actually runs quite smoothly. But this video is not really about making things like that. Now I've got my nice workshop and tools. This our video is more about conventional bearings. Of course, in ancient times they did use wood a lot as bearings. They made almost everything out of wood, so shafts and bearings were wood. It's not ideal because wood gets hot when it's with the friction. It has caused fires in mills. From the 16th century onwards, when tropical hardwoods became available, things improved. So some extraordinary woods were imported, like Lignum vitae, 3 times harder than oak. It's so hard, when you put it through the saw it comes out already polished. Much heavier than water, sinks like a stone. It actually feels quite oily. In fact, I can show you it as a bearing. So I've just drilled some holes in my bits of Lignum vitae. Just put it through here, and it runs perfectly smoothly. But it actually carried on being used for the bearings of ship propeller shafts right up until the 1960s. The Americans' first nuclear submarine had Lignum vitae bearings. But of course today there are lots more materials available and also very little Lignum vitae, so it's no longer used now. A much more common material that came into use in the Middle Ages is brass. Steel shafts running in brass is very common, really, if you think of all the classic Victorian bits of engineering. So brass was used for very big things like steam engines, but also for very tiny things, for clocks. So this is a just typical 19th century clock, though mechanical clocks are still made the same way. And there's always 2 brass plates, and all the gears and stuff are in the gap in the middle. This one's all gone rather rusty. And these steel shafts are just supported by the brass plates. You can see the holes, these little depressions, and that's where the ends of the shafts that run through. Now there's something interesting about these shafts. I'm just going to undo one of the shafts. This is the one that supports the pendulum. Now there's the shaft. That's the shaft. This has got the pallets, all very rusty. But the interesting thing about it is the ends of the shaft. You see how much smaller they are, both ends, very much smaller than the rest of the shaft. And these are what poke through the brass. This is the little hole that pokes through. And this obviously stops the shaft slipping sideways, but the other advantage is that it reduces the friction. I think it probably is because of the viscosity of the oil. There's less area for that to slow the thing down. I didn't used to use a lot of brass because it's quite expensive. I've only started using it recently since somebody retired and left me a whole lot of brass, and it's lovely stuff to turn. It's really quick to make pulleys and little bits and pieces, that collars and shaft mounts and that sort of thing. So I enjoy using it now. One thing I haven't talked about is oil. The friction of one material running on another is much less with an oil film between them. Put a drop of oil on. There's then actually a coating of oil all round the shaft. It's very thin, but it's enough to make quite a big difference. In fact, if you look at the tables of coefficients of frictions, it's like 10 times or more less friction. So although there's a drag from viscosity, solids run amazingly well in liquids, sort of almost friction free. In the 19th century, canal boats, which took about 70 tons load, they were pulled by horses along the bank, but when it went through a tunnel, the crew had to push them through with their legs. It was called legging it, and that's where the expression to leg it comes from. Today, there's still some of the beautiful Fresnel lens assemblies in lighthouses actually float in whole bars of mercury, almost 100 kilograms of the stuff. In the past, I used a lot more hard plastic, particularly this stuff called Delrin. Its proper name is acetal. It's the stuff that's used when you buy a plastic gear that's made of the same stuff. You can see how well it machines. You see the inside of the hole, how smooth it is. And that's just with a drill. So what I tend to do for a Delrin bearing, have a set of drills that go up in 0.1 mil increments. So for an 8 mil shaft, I'll use an 8.1 mil drill bit, and that just gives you a nice free running shaft, and I find that works better than using a proper reamer. A similar plastic, well, it's not really similar, but it's used for similar things, is Tufnol. Brown plastic. Traditionally this was quite an expensive thing. Its price has come down quite a lot now. It's extraordinary. It's actually layers of cloth and then under high pressure with the resin, and it makes a very rigid plastic. I really like this stuff. Oh, you can sort of see the texture of the cloth there too, yes. It's very hard wearing, as you can see in this arcade machine that I made a few years ago. In the housing ladder, you try to get a small figure inside to climb to the top. The figure is made of Tufnol. He's climbed the ladder about 55,000 times now, and there's still very little sign of wear in his joints.
Is there? Congratulations! The house is yours.
Hooray!
Conventional wisdom is that the bearing material is softer than the material of the shaft, but actually I quite often use steel as a bearing material with steel shafts. I use it all the time for prototypes, but also for things that don't run that fast or only run intermittently. It works surprisingly well, and then of course all you have to do is just drill a hole in a bit of steel, so it's very, very quick. If you've got box section, then you can drill 2 holes. If you're just starting out, a drill press is a great first tool to get. You can get little ones for really very cheap, because it means you can drill accurately at 90 degrees to something, so you make your holes perpendicular to the material, and also you have to push hard to drill through steel, and of course a drill press makes that really easily. And so, you know, that's your bearing done, and It actually spins pretty freely and will last a long time without too much wear. Best to grease it if it's a permanent thing, just because it'll start to squeak, but I think sometimes it's underestimated. And after all hinges are just steel running on steel. It's not that bad. So next I'm going to talk about bearing bushes. These go between the shaft and the material they're mounted on. And my favourite sort of bush is sintered bronze impregnated with oil. If we zoom in, I think you can almost see the structure. They're actually made of powdered bronze that's squashed together and then filled with oil when they're hot. They feel completely dry, but there is actually a lot of oil inside them. I'm now going to try and heat one up and with a heat gun and see if I can get some oil to come out of it. It's actually going to start dripping, I'm not sure. Oh yeah, there we go. So these bearings, they stay oiled for a very long time. I've never ever had to replace one actually in any of my machines. And they're quite easy to use. The fit isn't as critical as you might think. The outside, if it's too tight, you can quite often hammer it in or squish it in a vise. Sometimes I make the hole too big by mistake. It's just like for this one, for instance, I've got it a bit too big. So you can, even a loose baggy fit like that, you can put Loctite retaining compound in it, or you can sometimes dot punch around the steel around the edge to squish it in. I'll try and do that now. And it's pretty well held. Then the inside of these bearings, they're usually rather a tight fit to start with. So a good tool to use is a reamer. These you can buy them on eBay, or they're not that expensive, but they leave a smoother hole certainly in these bearings than a drill bit. Another quite common sort of bush is a plastic bush. Some plastics have been developed specifically for bearing uses. I used to use quite a few of them, and they initially they seem to work beautifully. So if I just they slide over a shaft really nicely. You don't have none of that fitting with a reamer or anything, and they just sort of they feel lovely. But the problem is they wear, or at least in my applications they wear. This water clock on Southall Pier has some plastic bearings. Wasn't a good choice. There's hardly anything left of them now. But somehow it all manages to carry on working despite the enormous wear. In most situations I've abandoned them. The one place where I still use plastic bushes, I use these small ones. I quite often use them inside Delrin because both Delrin and these, you don't need oil, they run dry. But the Delrin does wear with time, and these wear slightly less fast than the Delrin, so it can be an improvement. Another sort of bush used in watches are the jewels in watches. They are actually just the bearing bushes. This is a pocket watch, old pocket watch, proudly saying it has 15 joules. These are the joules. I don't know if you can see them round there. They're actually tiny little bits of ruby with holes cut in them. You can't really see their ruby in that one, but in this lady's watch, they're much more obviously red. I think you can almost see the hole through it in the one in the middle. I was going to say a little bit more about oil. One of the most important things about oiling bushes or any sort of bearing is not to put in too much. If you have just oil hanging about, it attracts dust and grit and becomes a sort of grinding paste, and I've had things wear quite badly with this. So it's amazing how little oil you actually need. This pen is my watch oiler, and so little comes out of it that I have to test it out on a bit of paper every time I use it, just to see whether. So if I do a little dip there, yeah, I can see that something is coming out. And so literally all I would need to do to oil my pocket watch, a bearing on the pocket watch, is just to put dip it in a couple of times, and I wouldn't even see that I'd oiled it, but I have. And the same is true for bigger things, though you can use a little bit more oil, obviously. Of course, some bearings, bushes, run completely submerged in oil. Most obviously in a car engine, in the sump, the bottom half of the engine's full of oil. And so the crankshaft is rotating in oil. So this is the shell and the bottom end of a big end. And the bearing is just, the bush is just this bit of metal on the inside, whoops, called white metal, very thin, and it's extraordinary really when you think about it, that this skinny little bit of metal, it rotates at least 2,000 times a minute and goes hundreds of thousands of miles. Usually the whole lifetime of a car you never have to replace these things, and that's all it is. I'd forgotten though, until I stripped that engine apart, that the crankshaft has holes in it, so that there is oil being squirted on the inside as it goes round. I'm sure that helps. There's also a weird thing. If dirt does get into a bush, sort of hard bits get embedded in the bush material, like in the white metal of the car engine or in one of my Oilite bushes. And these can be really hard bits that then wear away at the shaft. So you open up a damaged bearing and you find the hard part of it has worn more than the actual softer bearing material. Well, that's why. And so when you have to replace the big ends on a car, you nearly always have to have the crankshaft reground at the same time. In bushes, the shaft slides round the surface of the bush, so which is called sliding friction. The alternative is rolling friction. So to show you the difference, I'm going to use this great big lump of cast iron. I'm going to put on the bench and connect it to a spring balance. So to get it to move, just sort of nearly 3. And it's always more to get it started, and then it goes down a bit once you've got it moving. I could probably get it a bit lower by adding some oil to the table. And spread it around. Yeah, that's more like 2 or 2.4. Now it's got to stick a bit. So it's definitely a little bit better than it was before. But now rolling friction, and I'm going to roll the lump onto steel rollers. more. Okay, so connect the spring balance. And it's dramatically reduced. Yes, 1/4 of a kilogram, big difference. And that's why ball races are so widely used. They're wonderful, amazing things. The inner race rotates on the balls, which in turn roll against the stationary outer race. Leonardo had the idea, but it wasn't possible to make them until the 1870s. They were initially just designed for the first bicycles. So this is a ball race. There are 9 balls inside a cage in the middle, and so the balls roll round between the inner and the outer, and they do roll incredibly smoothly. If I get my blowgun and squirt a bit of compressed air onto the rim of the ball race, I'm not sure where it's going to go. It'll actually stay spinning for a very long time, several minutes. So ball races are good in any situation where you need low friction, and I use them quite a lot. It's quite often very useful to me. One particularly dramatic example was some gates I made for London Zoo. They were vertical sliding gates for a tiger enclosure, and they'd specified this very heavy solid metal to protect themselves from the tigers, obviously, and so the gates ended up being very, very heavy. I had to add pulley blocks to so you pulled further to lift the gate, and it all seemed to work fine, and it was passed initially by the keepers. But then late in the day they came to inspect the finished thing, and some of the keepers are actually very tiny and they couldn't lift the gates even with the pulley blocks. Well, I'd made it by then. It was sort of the first one. It would have been a major business to start all over again. But I realised that I just use ordinary yachting pulleys. These little things. Oh, I think the bearing has finally stopped spinning. Yeah, ordinary yachting pulleys. You can get yachting pulleys with ball races, but they're usually open ones, and because these were going in the tiger cages, I thought they'd all get clogged up with straw. And they were the only ones with ball races I could find. So I decided to make my own, and out of aluminium, with 2 ball races in between. I can show you the difference. It's dramatic. So this is the little yachting pulley that I first tried the tiger gates with. If I string it up here, this is 2.5 kilograms I'm lifting the weights. Put the spring balance on, and I have to lift with about 3.5 kilograms force. So now I'll swap this for my homemade pulley with bearings with ball races. It actually already feels less effort, though maybe that's psychological. And put the spring balance on, and yeah, it's less than 3. I don't know if you can see it exactly. What are we reading? God, it's sort of 2. It's varying a bit, but it goes between 2.5 and 2.9. So with the yachting pulley, the Bush yachting pulley, I was having to pull an extra kilogram more than the weight. So that was all the friction in the pulley. With the ball race, I was only having to pull an extra 1/4 of a kilogram. So 1/4 of the friction. Big difference. So even the tiniest keeper can now lift the gates easily. So there are millions of different sorts of bearings. but actually I usually use them way below their rated load and below their rated maximum speed. I usually just keep in stock one of each size: 6, 8, 10, 12 and 16. There are some varieties. You can get extra skinny ones so that the outer diameter is a lot smaller, and that's useful if you're tight for space, and it makes a particularly big difference when you get up to bigger diameter bearings. It can be very useful. Then you can also get stainless steel ones. They're good on the pier for me, with the salt air and everything, and they do last longer. So the other thing to know about bearings is that the edges, the shields, come in 3 different sorts. You can get an open one, or you can get a dust shield with little metal caps, or you can get the rubber ones, which are fully sealed, and then the oil lasts a lifetime. So I usually use the rubber ones, but if you're after low friction, it's not necessarily a good idea. Here I've got the full seal on that one, and just the dust shield on that one. So if I spin them both at the same speed, because there's more friction in the rubber seals, that one will stop spinning quite a lot sooner than the one with the dust shield. And there have been occasions where I wanted something with particularly low friction before I realised quite what a difference there was. So, mounting bull races. The inside of bull races are usually very straightforward. An ordinary bit of bright bar will fit through the hole. So I think this is a 20mm bearing, so that fits straight through. Now this bearing, this is a pillow block. This is one of the easiest ones to use because you can just bolt it to your machine, whatever it is. In mobility masterclass, you have to cross the motorway with the Zimmer frame. People often get a bit carried away using it, so the mechanism which moves the frame has to be very, very strong. Hence the big plumber's block down inside the bottom. And the other advantage, if I get a second pillow block on here, is that it doesn't matter if the things are misaligned. Even at some crazy angle, the bearing mounts will accommodate it. And it's quite clever how it does this. If I swivel this one right round and take it out, you can see the outer is curved. And similarly with the housing, it's dished. And that's why it enables the bearing to swivel around so nicely. Pillow blocks also come in a plate style, so you could mount a plate with your shaft running through it. The two styles, they're amazingly good value. Well, all bearings are amazingly cheap. I should have said I use just cheap ones. I don't bother with the expensive brand ones. So sometimes though, pillow blocks just take up too much space. Then I have to make my own bearing mounts. One thing I find useful is little bits of thick walled tube. This is called in England anyway, gas barrel tubing. So you can often get a bit of tubing that's a bearing. The outer diameter of the bearing is just bigger than the inside diameter of the tube, and then you can just turn it down on the lathe. And if you do both ends, you end up with a very nice sort of two holes, precisely concentric, so they're properly aligned. And then of course it's very easy, you just weld the tube to whatever you want to. Another material that is useful for mounting bearings I find is Delrin, and it's easiest if you start off with a round bar, because again you can just turn them down to the right diameter on the lathe, and in this case I just cut a flat on the bottom of it to mount it. So that's another one I use. Sometimes you do have to mount bearings on a flat plate, I find it hard to get the boring bar on my milling machine to be very precise. So a trick that I use are these things called tolerance rings. So you drill your hole a bit oversize. It gives you, it tells you when you buy the tolerance ring, it doesn't have to be too precise. It's quite a range. Will work with this. You fit your tolerance ring in the hole, and then your bearing, made a little bit of persuasion. Let's tap it in place. Fits in very snugly. And the other advantage is that the tolerance ring does allow for a bit of misalignment as well. So one drawback of bull races is that there's a very limited area of contact between the inner and the outer race, just where they touch the balls. And so there's enormous pressure on these areas. So this effectively limits the load that they can carry. If you need a large load, more than to reduce friction, you're better off with a bush. So something like this digger, all the pins on the arm and the grab at the bottom, they're all bushes rather than bull races. Well, one way you can increase the area on a bull race is to use rollers rather than balls. So you can see the little rollers inside. They're little rollers, and they rub against the shaft. And I love these things because they take up very little space, and they run very, very freely. I was amazed that you buy them often without an inner race, just the rollers and the outer race, and they will run very happily just an ordinary bright steel bar. So if I put a couple on, these are 8mm roller bearings, and it'll go on spinning for a nice long time, and I just thought the shaft would wear. Also, I worried that dirt would get in, as they're not fully sealed with rubber seals, but again, that's been less of a problem than I thought, and I've had some that have been then machines for over 10 years now. One drawback with roller bearings is that they can slip perfectly happily sideways. There's nothing to stop them slipping along the shaft. The Timken company invented a way around this problem of making a tapered roller bearing, and these are often used in pairs. So the wheels of cars often have a pair of tapered roller bearings. These easily take tremendous sideways loads when you're cornering in a car. Another place I use roller bearings, tiny ones, is on cam mechanisms. This is a roller bearing for a 3mm shaft, and what I quite often do is to put this through a cap head stainless bolt. The bolts often have an unthreaded bit at the top, and sometimes I have to run a die over it to make it the right amount of unthreaded bar left. Then you can just thread this through, and it's a very loose fit because it's not an accurate 3mm on the bolt, but it does run very, very smoothly. So this makes a very good cam follower. That's a better way round. So now as the cam goes round, the cam follower is turning on the roller bearing. The load is all taken by the roller bearing, and so this dip here is particularly steep, and so that's got to rise pretty quickly as it goes up. And if you didn't have a roller bearing, that probably wouldn't work. Before I leave roller bearings, there's one very unusual sort of roller bearing. It looks just like any other roller bearing. There's a little arrow on it, and this roller bearing, it's called a sprag clutch. It'll only turn in one direction, and you might think, what on earth uses that? But actually I found them quite useful in my arcade machines, particularly where people are turning handles. But I thought I'd have to give you an example to make sense of it. I'm just going to push this strag clutch into a bit of Delrin. So this is just an 18mm hole in a bit of Delrin. And then I'm also going to need a handle to turn. So we'll just... So now I've just got a rod, a bit of bar and a bit of string to pull this weight along. So if I put the bar through, now I attach my handle. Now what this does, if I go that way, nothing happens at all. If I go the other way, it'll pull the string. So if on a machine, if people were turning that way, it wouldn't do anything. If they turn it the right way, it'll pull the weight. The last sort of bearings I'm going to talk about is linear bearings. Linear bearings come with sliding versions and rolling versions. So this is a simple slider, just a carriage that goes up and down an aluminium rail. It's useful because it's very compact, but it's not perfect, it has a limited life. One up from that are draw slides, and I use quite a lot of these things, and these are rolling friction. Slight problem with draw slides is that this carriage with the balls can get out of alignment. That end is just slipping without the carriage moving. So there's another version which has this clever bit of cloth that stops them getting out of alignment. I like these, they are pretty good. The 2-ton school run has a linear bearing running on a long shaft inside to make the car go up. It works very, very well. This is a lovely linear bearing. This is the bit that was left over from the 2-ton school run. If I take one of the carriages off the end, you can see there are rows of little balls in there, and they move round. Well, you might think, how on earth do they do that? And it is extraordinarily clever. This is the linear bearing that I've stripped. So this top row is in contact with the shaft. The bottom row is right hidden inside the bearing, and that's where the balls return, ready to come round again. They stay stationary on the shaft, but all run round the back to join in again. Now the one drawback with the circular type linear bearings is that they take up quite a bit of space. So if that's a problem, there are then these wonderful things. These are rectangular section rail, and the bearing is completely rigid in all dimensions, so that's all you need to make an object move. Of course the load would be limited, but for a lot of the things I do, just a single carriage is perfectly adequate, and you can get them in other sizes as well. It's exactly the same principle as the circular carriage with the recirculating balls. With experience, it's still very easy to make mistakes. So I thought I would end with one. It's a machine I made a couple of years ago and made quite a mess of the bearings. It's a miniature Amazon warehouse where you have to rush around picking as many products as you can against the clock while walking. Well, it's the walking mechanism I had problems with. This is the prototype. It's really quite simple. I mean, there's nothing much to go wrong, you'd think. But after being on the pier a couple of months, all sorts of things started happening. An E-clip popped off, a shaft half came out. It's just a succession of things. I was under the machine every month or so, adding bits and pieces and trying to get it to work. Eventually I got it back to the workshop. Well, that prototype's long gone, I don't keep them. So for this video I've made a small working model. It took me a couple of hours. So that's the walking mechanism. your feet would go on there. It is very simple, and each of these is a pair of bearings. So I'd worked out that the problem was that people, particularly when they get enthusiastic, there are some very odd sort of side loads that get imposed on the frame. So you can actually see this shaft bend as I push it sideways. And of course a heavy person can quite quickly do a lot of damage. And it puts a lot of stress on, these would have been the two bull races, only 20 mil apart. So quite a lot of twisting force on those bearings. Well, once I got it back in the workshop, I quite quickly managed to think of a way around it. So the solution was to space out the bearings at the top. Before they were 20 mil apart, and I think in the final version they're now probably about 150 mil apart. So it's a big difference. So if I now reassemble my model, but the inner one is now fixed to a new support in the center there. So that's the new arrangement, and I think you can see it's much more rigid to these sort of loads, pushing it in and pulling it out, just by spreading these bearings out from there to there. And actually I've had no more trouble with the machine ever since, so it's actually very satisfying. Well done. We're delighted to offer you a 0 hours contract at the fulfillment centre. I think perhaps the thing about experience, you still make mistakes, but when something goes badly wrong like this, you don't think, oh no, it's hopeless. You just think, oh, that's an interesting problem. And so I quite enjoy it. I'd be bored if things didn't go wrong, really. Anyway, that's enough of bearings. Bye bye.